Okay, we're going to hand over now to Billy Kay, who's going to give us a wee chat as well.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a long haul, and there's been lulls. The likes of the first debate was a lull. Everybody felt slightly that the momentum had stopped. Fortunately, it's now gathered up again. Because of the First Minister's performance the other night, that gave people a boost of energy. There are a couple other stories that I've picked up in my travels, giving talks. One from Strathbethar in the north, and one from West Fife, with Yes activists there. The kind of stories that you'll no get in the hostile media. In the Highlands, I was told that they're polling and they're canvassing there. The worst area was Malig, and it was 50 to 55% yes in Malig. That was by far the worst. In the rest of the Highland area, it was 70% yes. And I, being cynical, said, you sure that's no folk getting rid of you? You're chapping the doors, just wanting rid of you? No, that was backed up by telephone canvassing as well. So I think it's pretty certain. Meanwhile, in the housing schemes of West Fife, and this is maybe paralleled with the Radicals for Independence campaign and some of the schemes, they're saying that in West Fife it's between 70 and 80% yes in the big housing schemes in West Fife. So basically, keep the energy going because it's all to play for, and we've got 2 weeks left. I wrote an article that Yes Scotland asked me to do in the Scotsman a few weeks ago. And if you want to see the bile of unionists, you should see some of the comments in the Scotsman's comments page after it. I'll vote yes on September 18 because I'm a Scot, and I want my wonderful multi-ethnic, multilingual mongrel nation to draw on its rampant egalitarian traditions and create a country which the world will regard as a model for progressive social, environmental and political ideals of inclusion, fairness and justice. That's all. Normal desire for a normal inhabitant of a normal country. Unfortunately, Scotland is not a normal society because most of us have not been educated in our own culture. Most of us were brought up to regard the various dialects of Scots that we speak or the various dialects of Gaelic that we spoke as children as having little status. I was brought up in the Burns country in Ayrshire, and one of the ironies of an Ayrshire childhood in the 50s was you got a prize for reciting Rabbie Burns's poetry a day a year, then you get the belt for speaking his language the other 365 days of the year. Hugh McDermott said, to be yourself and to make that worth being, nae harder job to mortals has been given. And I think it's hard to be completely yourself if you're not educated in your culture and your history. The Catalans call this process the slave mentality that they've suffered from because of their language and literature being downplayed. Here in Scotland we call it the Scottish cringe. And I collect examples of the Scottish cringe. One of my favourites was a Labour convener for Tayside region about 15 years ago, where he was asked if Scottish studies should be an integral part of the school's curriculum, and he replied, oh no, we live in a multicultural environment. In other words, every culture was to be taught except the native one, except the Scottish one. And that is what a warped mentality these people have. You've seen it coming out in spade loads during the campaign. Jenny Mara, in a televised debate, the loudest applause of the evening was when she said that the oil would run out in 20 years. The crowd went wild. Tories from the borders, loving the idea that their country would be impoverished and that would stop the union with England. Incidents like great writers like Alistair Gray and Jim Kelman being accused of being anti-English when they had the temerity to suggest that it would be good if the head of Creative Scotland actually knew something about Scottish culture. Now, these are all examples of what doesn't happen in a normal society. A classic too was, I'm a member of the cross-party group for the Scots language in the Parliament, and I've done my patriotic chore literally since the Parliament opened, and it's been a hard fecht at times for it, occasional successes. But one of my worst moments came where I spoke to, again, a Labour Minister of Culture and asked him if he'd received the invitation by the cross-party group. And the invitations were sent bilingually in Scots and in English. And the Minister for Culture replied, "Oh, that thing in the funny writing, I threw it in the bin." That is the attitude of a Minister, Labour for Culture, to the native culture of Scotland. And that is why you see them in their ermine-clad dreams, trying to ding doon Scotland and the inhabitants of Scotland, because their future is guaranteed. They are better together, they are richer together, but to hell with the vast majority of the Scots people that they should be representing. I would love Scotland to be a normal society, but I think it'll take independence to get rid of the cringe, because it's been there for a long time. James Boswell, when he was introduced to Dr. Johnson, the great Scotophobe, said, "Oh, I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it." And that's been right through the history of Scotland, that looking over our shoulder to England for models of how to behave. Fortunately, eventually, we decided we were too long in this condition and we reacted against it. And the modern national movement began in the 1920s and 30s. And it was started by some of the great figures of Scottish literature. Compton Mackenzie, Hugh MacDiarmid, Eric Linklater, and one of my favourites, Don Roberto or R.B. Cunningham Graham. This is him in his gap years as a gaucho in Argentina when he was a teenage boy. He was the founder of the Labour Party with Keir Hardie in the 1880s, and then he saw the light and founded the National Party of Scotland in 1926. And one of my favourite quotes that to me is the perfect illustration of how we should view the people on the Labour side especially, who are against Scottish independence. Cunningham Graham at a Bannockburn rally in 1936, just before he died, said, "The enemies of Scottish nationalism are not the English, for they were ever a great and generous folk, quick to respond when justice calls. Our real enemies are among us, born without imagination." Now, does that not sum them up perfectly? People who can't imagine living in a better country, when there are insults to our intelligence with their attitude to that country all around. A lot of them, especially people who should know better, who are now in the House of Lords, like Lord Robertson, saying that the Scottish independence would unleash the forces of darkness. When I think of the Home Rule tradition in the Labour Party that they came from, a friend of mine, Derek Maguire, a Fife miner, summed it up perfectly in my programme on the history of Scottish nationalism, The Cause, when he said, you hear these people and you talk about folk burling in their graves, Keir Hardie's should be fitted with a Rev Cunter. So when I hear the Labour Party ranting against the Scottish people, which is what they're doing at the moment, I think of a great wit called Oliver Brown, who wrote in the Scots Independent newspaper. And when Winnie Ewing won the first seat for the SNP back in the 1960s, he wrote, "A shudder went through the Scottish members of Parliament, frantically looking for a spine to run up." My experience with working for the BBC for many years, doing documentaries for the BBC, was a narrowing of Britishness. When I started making documentaries for the BBC back in the early 1980s, I did a working class history series called Odyssey, about Dundee jute spinners, about the Glasgow Irish, about farmers in Forfar going to the Fian markets. These programmes were broadcast on Radio 4 at that time. Nothing like that is broadcast on Radio 4 at all. In fact, when I proposed, I eventually gave up on them, when I proposed ethnic Scottish programmes to Radio 4, it got to the stage where they almost laughed that anybody would be interested in such things. And when I did programmes for Radio 4, ironically, my budget was 2/3 what it was for a Scottish programme. So some of us are better together, but I can assure you we can do a lot better as broadcasters in an independent Scotland. My ideal Scotland is one that's strongly local, like Dundee, proudly national and totally international in outlook. And I think the three are interdependent. I've had a great lot of pleasure meeting Scots who have been away from Scotland for generations, but who, because of the tradition of literacy that we've had before most countries in the world, because of John Knox's Reformation, they kept their records, they were literate, they knew who they were, they still know who they are. Professor Carol Tyler in Gdansk, Colonel John Crafford in Sweden, people who know who they are and go back to the 17th century in Scotland. Great figures that have enhanced the countries they've lived in. For example, in Norway, three of the greatest Norwegians in history, Anne mentioned Norway, three of the greatest Norwegians in history are the statesman W.F.K. Christie, whose people came from Montrose, still come back here to visit, Edvard Grieg, the composer, whose people came from Aberdeenshire, and Peter Dass, the son of Peter Dundas, a merchant from Dundee, all part of this great Scottish diaspora. What I would like, though, is for that diaspora to have the chance of coming home, for children now with an international outlook having the chance to make it here as well as internationally. And if power is returned to Scotland, a lot of our brightest and best will come home and contribute to Scotland. I'll end by going back to the heart and head duality that I referred to at the beginning, because we need a lot more hearts flying to heads in the next couple of weeks to make sure that we win. In my series, The Cause, I recorded a remarkable piece of oral history from Winnie Ewing. Winnie told the story of having a dram on Burnsnicht at the Caledonian Club in London with Sir Alec Douglas Hume, head of the British state and the head of British unionism. And as they were having a dram, to Winnie's astonishment, Sir Alec Douglas Hume said, "You know, Winnie, in my heart I'm a Scottish nationalist, but my head tells me otherwise." And quick as a flash, Winnie said, "Well, Alec, you know what Robert Burns would say to you, no? Nae treasure nor pleasure can mak us happy lang. The heart eyes the paired eye that makes us recht or wrang." And even Alec Douglas Hume was impressed by that statement. So, I would like to go back to another great bit of poetry that I hope after September 18th I never have to say again. It's the last words in my book, Scots the Mother Tongue. And it's MacDiarmid writing in the 30s when Scotland was at its lowest ebb, but trying to project a future for his nation. And it's a great line, and he says, "For we hae faith in Scotland's hidden poors, the present's theirs, but all the past and future's ours." I want to stop using it on September 19 because it will mean we've finally seized the time, and the present's ours as well as the past and future. So, my brother and sister Scots, I appeal to you to vote positively for Scotland come September. For me, it's all to do with dignity. You may be comfortable in your dual Scottish and British identity, but for once in your life you have to choose which is most important to you. Do you belong to a proud, ancient nation or a quaint and colourful British region? Great for the grouse shooting on the glorious 12th, but independent, you're joking. Vote no, and you confirm to England and the world your provincial mentality, and you have to accept the provincial status that Scotland will endure from then on. Vote yes, and restore Scotland to the international family of nations she will grace with her presence forevermore. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Billy. And just